Hey everyone, mute as we come in the room. I'm going to go ahead and get us stream into Facebook so everybody can see us, and then we get going with the Q&A. So please be sure to mute yourself, and we'll get going.
Oh, is this a thing?
I suppose I should take myself off mute. All right, we are officially live in the Facebook group. So I am so excited to talk to everybody today. My name is Nicole, and I am a grant writing coach at Nonprofit for Newbies. I own and operate Rubber City Development Consulting, which is a full service grant writing and consulting firm, and I do state and federal grant opportunities. I also work with Funding for Social Change as a grant writer and client lead to help them in all of their nonprofit endeavors as well. So that was like the short mini version of my resume, but basically I live, breathe, sleep nonprofit organizations, and I do a lot of state and federal grants. So that's why I'm here today, to offer my expertise to you and to answer any questions you have about the federal grant process. So I'm going to talk a little bit about federal grants just to give you a little bit of a background of how today's session is going to go. Please be sure to mute yourself as you come in. Thank you so much. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of how this is going to go. I'm going to talk a little bit about government grants, some things that you should know, some key points, and manage a little bit of expectations, because I know a lot of people here are newer nonprofit founders, and I kind of want to give you a trajectory from where you're at currently and how you get to a point where you can get federal grant ready. And then what I'm going to do is, as you have a question, you would please raise your hand. In the Zoom box, you should have a box at the bottom where you can hit reactions, and then what I'm going to do is, if you have a question in the Zoom box, you should have a. I am so sorry, there is a delay and I am hearing myself talk somewhere. Okay, no, I think we're good. All right, so what I'm going to do is have you, if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and then I will get to you in the order that you raise your hand in. And the first thing I'm going to do is give you a little bit of a rundown of really what we look for federal and state grant readiness. So, of course, a lot of people in this group tonight are newer nonprofit founders. And so you may still be on your journey to your basic grant readiness, but you will eventually get to a point where you can apply for regular federal grants. And so I will not lie to you, it is more difficult than regular foundation grants, obviously, because it tends to be a lot more money. We're talking 300,000 all the way up to more than $1 million. I just applied for a $1.5 million grant a couple weeks ago. So the funding is really, really large, tends to cover more things than regular foundations, and really there's a lot more paperwork involved with doing federal grants. And so just to give you some background on some things that you should be looking at right now, even if you're not federal and state grant ready yet, you should be making sure that you have your ducks in the row on paperwork. So what kind of paperwork could you possibly need? Like all the paperwork, but there's a couple things that I want to really call out to you that you should need. And so the first thing you want to do when you're determining your federal and state grant readiness is apply for a SAM number. And so a SAM account gives you your unique entity identifier, which I know is complicated, and why do they make it this complicated, right? But your UEI is what labels you as a nonprofit to the government. And I'm going to type this in the chat. But sam.gov is what the account is called. And then a UEI is a unique entity identifier. And for everybody who started the state and federal grant process before the last year or so, a UEI used to be called a DUNS number. If everybody would please mute yourself, that would be awesome. A unique entity identifier replaced a DUNS number, which was a way old-fashioned thing that's been going on for the longest time in federal grants. And it requires you to renew it every year. So be sure to stay on it, because the one thing I get, even with my experienced federal grant clients, is that nobody remembers to renew the UEI number, and then they miss out on grant opportunities. And that's not what we want at all. We want you to be able to go in, apply to as many grants as possible, and really be impactful. And the second thing I want to say before we go and open it up to whatever questions you have, because it's a question and answer session. So I want to let everybody get in as many as they have. Federal grants are really rare in the fact that they allow you to apply for a lot of salaries. A majority of my recent federal grants, from 300,000 to 1.5 million, like 80% of the grant itself was salaries and benefit costs, which is amazing. Additionally, federal and state grants also do multi-year funding. A majority of the grants I apply for give you funding for 3 years. So it allows you quite a bit of funding for an extended period of time, which really is a game changer for organizations. So I am going to stop just droning on and saying boring things over here. Let's open it up for some questions. What questions do you have? There's no question that is too small or too silly, because the federal grant process is one that is constantly complicated, and I would really love to offer any advice. So please be sure to keep yourself muted and raise your hand in the reactions for your Zoom. Brianna.
Hello. I wanted to know, what is the difference from grant funding from a for-profit versus a nonprofit? Like, is there any, I guess, the parameters around like the funding? I know you said with federal funding for a nonprofit, you'll get a longer amount of a time where they'll be funding you. Is that the same thing for a for-profit?
So that actually, and I know this is not the answer you want to hear at all, that actually depends on the specific RFP you are going for. And so when we have federal grant funding or even state grant funding, we get something when the actual funding opens called an RFP, and that is a request for proposals. Sometimes it's also called a request for application, or a NOFO, a notice of funding opportunity. I know all the acronyms, right? And that really, it will be listed in there. And so another unique thing about federal and state grants is that they do offer funding for for-profit entities. A lot of times they will have different categories that you can apply under for certain funding opportunities. For example, I was just doing an Office of Justice Programs for the Department of Justice grant, and they had 6 different categories. And the categories covered everything from for-profit entities to tribal government to town and city government, all the way to what they call at the government level, community-based organizations, which is what a nonprofit is as per the government. And so it really depends on the RFP, but generally speaking, there are some differences in what they allow for-profit entities. Generally, there's not as much funding, but most of the funding opportunities tend to have some sort of allocation for for-profit entities.
Okay, that was my main wondering. And then And so you have to be registered as a nonprofit. Like you have to have your 501c3 status to go for most of these grants.
So not necessarily for the government. It really depends on what kind of funding you want to go for. What for-profit entity are you looking to apply for? Could you tell me kind of what you do, and I can give you a little bit more background?
Financial education. And so
Okay, so
Mhm.
there's actually quite a bit of education for for-profit entities, like daycares, colleges, charter schools can apply for federal funding. And you do not have to have a 501c3 to apply for that. You don't have to have a 501c3 to apply for SAM.gov. So you really could go and check out grants.gov right now and see what you would apply for. But again, there is a lot of federal grant readiness, even for-profit entities. So I would be doing a lot of research on the grant process and what you need to be ready.
Okay, and you said grants.gov?
Yeah, and I'll talk more about grants.gov in a minute, but that is where we look for federal grant opportunities generally, is grants.gov.
Okay, and then one last question now, get out your hair. Do you write for profits or just for nonprofits?
I write for some for-profits, and generally speaking, I will only write state and federal grants for for-profits because there's not enough foundation grants. And so if you wanted to talk to me about a for-profit grant, I have a special nonprofit for newbies consultation link that you can schedule a couple minutes to chat and see if we'd even be a good fit together.
Okay.
But I do write government grants for for-profit entities. I've done education grants at the government level. I've done USDA grants at the government level for for-profit entities.
Okay, thank you so much.
You are so welcome. Thank you for your question. So let me look at the chat. So what's the likelihood of being funded if you're under a fiscal sponsor? Michelle, this is an amazing question because fiscal sponsors work a lot differently at the government level. And so when we talk about, I'm so sorry. When we talk about federal funding, there is a lot of caveats. And so when you have a fiscal sponsor and you're applying for federal funding, generally speaking, you have to apply as the fiscal sponsor. You cannot do like you do with regular foundation grants where it's your organization applying and then your fiscal sponsor is just kind of giving you the paperwork to apply, right? Your fiscal sponsor has to be the organization applying, and you have to be listed as what they call a pass-through entity. And a pass-through entity is an organization that is given funding from the actual grant funding. And so generally speaking, this will be a chunk, but not all. But with fiscally sponsored projects, that's a little bit different. But the structure for getting this funding is that the fiscal sponsor is the applying organization, and your project is a pass-through funded project. And I could speak about it for hours because this is one of the more convoluted things in the government grant stream because there's a lot of paperwork involved in making this run appropriately. And my personal professional recommendation is to not go for federal grants until you have a 501 because of how convoluted it is. And it tends to leave a lot of money on the table for you, and you don't get a ton of money for your effort in that situation. So that's just my professional opinion because it is more complicated. There's a lot more steps. There's a lot more paperwork with pass-through funding. And generally, a lot of organizations don't like to do that. But thank you so much. Can I go over the UEI again? Yes, of course I can. So originally, when government grants started, we had something called a DUNS number. And I know a majority of us here have probably heard DUNS at some point or another. And a DUNS number really was our tax ID number for government grants. And so they would want to see both numbers, right? Well, what happened actually in April of 2022 was that they phased out the DUNS number because it was ran by a private company. And the government wanted to be able to step in and have more control over this process. And so they instituted a unique entity identifier. And so basically, you know how we all have tax ID numbers for our nonprofits? A UEI does the same thing that a tax identifier does, but it identifies us directly to the government for grant funding. And to get this unique entity identifier, you have to have a sam.gov account. So that's SAM, and it is in the chat, .gov. And so you create an account through sam.gov, and you're able to go in there, register your organization, and get a UEI number. And that is what you use at grants.gov, Just Grants, all the other grant websites the government uses to identify your organization to the funders. So thank you so much. Let me see. As a victim service agency, we have received state funding. Are you able to reconstruct a state grant for a federal grant, since we never wrote a federal grant, which is typically more complicated than a state grant? Like if it's the same pot of federal money, the state gets it. So there's kind of two answers here, and I hope L. Carter could give us a little bit of clarity, Gigi, if they're still in the chat. So you would definitely be able to reconstruct a majority of a state grant narrative for a federal grant. I do that all the time. We call it boilerplate language, where when you've created something, it's so pretty, you just want to use it over and over again instead of reinventing the wheel. And that is something that is really, really commonly done in grants, and you can totally do. Now to the second part of your question, you have to be careful with what they call pass-through funding, what we were just talking about. You have a money can pass through from an organization to another organization, but money also passes through from the federal government to the state government. And you get double jeopardy sometimes. You have to be careful what you apply for, because you can't apply for a state grant that is funded by the same money federally that you want to apply for. For example, say you got a Department of Justice grant at the state level. You then could not apply for the same kind of grant at the federal level, because the way that the Appropriations Committee labels those funds, they're in the same pot, and we can't go for the same thing twice. And so you have to be really careful when you look at that. So if you could provide us some clarity on what you mean by that, I hope that is answering exactly what you need, but feel free to let us know if I need to expand on that a little bit. So how am I paid, and do any grants cover your services? So generally speaking, when you pay a grant writer or a fundraiser, the National Association of Fundraisers does not like you to go for any grants paying for services, anything like that, typically because the grants that you apply for, you have to use exactly for what you said you use them for, which is generally programs, operational expenses, and to do anything other that would be misappropriation of funds. And so how I get paid for my services and my company services and the services I offer for Nonprofit for Newbies, I work on a retainer. And so the retainer works and does a lot of different things. If you want to talk to me about it further, feel free to schedule a Calendly with me. But the retainer covers a lot of things, including grant research. It includes, I create you a dashboard in my grant management software. I do a lot of different things, including creating letters of interest, writing proposals, submitting proposals. When you win funding, I help you figure out a process to track your expenditures. And then I help you even report on that funding when it has been done. So lots of different things. So if you're looking for a grant writer and want to get into more particulars, feel free to hit me up on my Nonprofit for Newbies Calendly link, so that I can talk to you more in depth outside of the group setting, and we can get more one-on-one with your needs. And so I see a question from Gina here. Are the UEI numbers free? Yes, UEI numbers are 100% free. And thank you for bringing this up, because from time to time, you'll see when you Google like UEI number or sam.gov, a couple of the first options will be get your UEI or something, and they'll have you pay for it. And those are 100% scams. The government is never going to have you pay for this. They're never going to have you put your credit card information in. So if you go to a website and you're looking to get your UEI and it's asking you for these things, please run in the opposite direction. We don't want that. The government does not charge for this. Sometimes it does take a couple days for it to come back. That's not a problem at all. They have to file the paperwork and things, right? But don't pay anybody for a rush fee. Don't put your credit card in anywhere. UEI numbers are 100% free. Okay, do you get the cage code first, then the UEI, or do you get the UEI automatically? So generally speaking, cage codes are not as common. I mean, everybody gets a cage code, but it's not one thing that you usually have to keep track of. And so I wouldn't worry about your cage code. You will, when you go onto SAM.gov, it will not be automatic that you get a UEI. You'll sign up to a SAM.gov account, and then it'll ask you to add an organization or confirm an organization, something like that, in which point you would give them all of your verification documents, your EIN. You'd be able to tell them that basically, I'm the one that runs this organization. And then they have you add authorized users. And these are the people that can apply for grants and do official things on the organization's behalf. And then about a week, maybe 2 weeks later, because sometimes it does take a couple of days, you'll get a notification that you'll get your UEI number back. And so just be aware of that. You did all that and you're waiting on your cage code. So the SAM.gov people are actually really nice to talk to on the phone. If you are still waiting on your cage code, I would give them a call. They're really easy to talk to on the phone. Like, one of the only government agencies that I enjoy speaking to is the Department of Justice and SAM.gov. They're very nice. So I would give them a call and see what's up, because usually the cage code isn't the hang up. Usually it is the UEI itself. So I'm sorry that you're having that situation. Let me see. Yeah, definitely. Everybody, if you have a UEI, be sure to check. And what I do is, for all the organizations I work with that do federal grants, I actually will put the UEI expiration date in my calendar like a week ahead of time, so I know when to go back and reschedule or renew it. Let me see. Awesome. I think I'm out of questions here. Let me see here. All right. Does anybody have any new questions? Okay, so can you apply for grants even though you have a home address? So I'm assuming we're talking about federal grants, even though you're using a home address here. Really, as long as your home address checks out for something that you use for your nonprofit, you totally can. I actually just applied for a transitional housing grant. I think it was a Department of Justice grant. Don't quote me on that. No, it was Office of Violence or something, OBW grant. And they actually only use their home address. And so that was not a hindrance at all in that application. And we ended up submitting $700,000. So definitely don't let yourself be limited by having a home address instead of an office address. Go for it. Are there grants for nonprofit startup? So there are grants for nonprofit startup, but I do want to stress to everyone that state and federal grants should not be on your horizon until you are a strong organization. And I don't mean that you've got to have $1 million budget. I don't mean that you have to have a bunch of staff. What I mean is that you want to be a 501c3 nonprofit. You want to have all of your programs down. Your programs need to be actively serving people, and you need to have really measurable impacts and outcomes. So what can you do in the meantime to get there? There's a lot of things you can do. Surround yourself with a strong board, a strong group of volunteers. Go through the strategic planning process, which really gives you a roadmap for where your organization is and how it can get to where you want to be. Doing all of these things will get you to a point where your organization is really, really strong. And at that point, you'll be able to get foundation grants and be more and more regular grant worthy. When you're able to get foundation grants fairly easily, then it's time to go on to federal and state grants. So just to manage expectations there, it's not, this is not a fix-all for newer nonprofits. It is a very, very laborious experience. But we want to be sure to manage those expectations and let you know that it is possible, but there is a lot of work to get there. So this isn't something that an unestablished nonprofit should be applying for, but it's something that you should be looking to the horizon on and say, you know, I can do things X, Y, and Z to get there. So I'm sorry, I know that's not the greatest answer, but it's the honest one. And if you have any like really in-depth questions about like how you can get to that point, please let me know. What items do we need to have in place to set our organization apart against the competition? Thank you so much for that, Gigi, for monitoring the Facebook. I appreciate you. So really one of the biggest things that a lot of people fall really short on, because most of us in this group can really write about what our programs do, right? The narrative part, which is what we would call like writing about our activities and our programs, is the easy part. The hardest part of any grant, and it's one that even the experienced organizations, like really big organizations I work with, struggle with, is the evaluation component. And what we think of when we think of an evaluation component is our outcomes, our impact, how we collect data and determine if our programs are actually working. That is really where a lot of the grants that I've reviewed, a lot of the grants that I've seen that I haven't written, a lot of the previous grants from clients have really fallen short. And so what I've seen when taking government review classes is that if you're able to make this a really robust section of your grant, if you're able to make that evaluation really pop, you are immediately adding 10 points to your grant application that your competitors don't have. And so really what you should do now as newer nonprofit founders is sit down with your group and determine, you know, how can we count our impact? How are we collecting data? How are we reporting that data? How are we able to write that down and determine how our programs are actually impacting the people that we serve? And so really, you know, getting that impact, getting that evaluation down is going to 100% set you apart from the competition and is what makes or breaks a federal grant application. So how much do I charge to prepare for grant funding? That is a loaded question. So my packages start at $800 a month for retainers and go up from there. I do have a DIY package that is $1,000 and like prepares you and gives you all the templates you need to be able to go and apply for grants, gives you a year of grants to apply for. And then I have what I call coaching calls, which are $100 an hour, that really are where we go through grant readiness checklists. We go through, you know, what you have, what you don't have, what you need to create, and help give you all of the tools you need to be successful in grant funding. And if anyone wants to speak more directly about that, feel free to schedule a free 15-minute consultation at my Calendly, and I can send you my package list so you can get a better idea, because my packages are like 5 pages long of stuff that I can offer. So be sure to check that out. Are there any nonprofit organizations that I don't work with? That's a good question. There's not a lot of nonprofits that I don't work with. I'll work with just about anybody as long as they're doing good and promoting kindness in the world. I feel like that was a lame answer, but I think I've only turned away 1 or 2 nonprofit organizations because they weren't promoting kindness. They were being more hateful than kind. And that's all we need to do is we need to fix the world, not make it worse, right? And so if you're out there helping people, I want to work with you. All right, does anybody else have any more questions? I feel like, oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I feel like I am like answering really, really quickly. Let me give you, since we are running out of questions, let me give you a little bit of background on some sticking points that I run into with a lot of grants that not a lot of people are prepared for. And so one of the sticking points is in terms of partnerships. So a lot of federal and state grants want you to have partners. And granted, I'm sure most people here have some sort of organizational partners, but you may not have made them official and put them down on paper. So for federal and state grants, they want official everything, right? And so I know our Learning Academy people heard about this a couple weeks ago, but I'm so sorry to bore you again. I'm going to talk about it again. What federal grants look for are memorandums of understanding and letters of support. So, and they will often require you to submit these with your application. So something you can be doing as part of your grant readiness process is to connect with your partners. Talk to them about getting something official on paper. A memorandum of understanding acts very similarly to a contract. It's just not as official. Basically, it says, I'm going to do this thing to help the people that we serve, and you are going to do this thing. And it shows how you're both going to be helping each other to be able to help more people. And then a letter of support is basically a letter from the organization that you're partnering with saying how you help each other. So that is very much the less official way of maintaining a partnership, but it is still something that federal grants require and want you to provide. So just to give you a little bit of background on some really important things that not a lot of people think about, and it tends to be when I start writing for somebody, that tends to be the thing that's forgotten. And then it's 2 hours before the deadline and we are rushing to get people to sign memorandums of understanding. Do you need to have a business plan before you apply for a grant? That is a really good question. I would 100% recommend that you do, because your business plan should be a roadmap to how your nonprofit operates. And if you have a roadmap for yourself and can tell yourself and the people around you what you do, then you can tell anybody else. And your business plan can operate as a boilerplate as well. So you already have a bunch of language that you can reuse for grants, and it's already making your life easier. You can use it over and over again to help fill out your grant applications. What if our organization is successful but has next to zero funds at the moment? Is that a negative to the government for funding? So not necessarily. A lot of times for foundation grants, they will ask us, like, who has funded you recently, right? That's a really thorn in our side kind of question. And that will be a little bit of a red flag. If you say, no, we don't have any funding, but we need, $20,000, can be a little bit of a red flag. However, with government funding, they just want your budget. I have, and this may not be universal, but I have never seen them require you to provide proof of funding, anything like that. They just want the program budget. They barely ever ask for an organizational budget. So it would probably not hurt your chances at all for government funding or state funding. So that's a positive. What are some fundraising ideas for agencies operating under fiscal sponsors? Are you eligible for Amazon Smile? So you are not eligible for Amazon Smile because your fiscal sponsor probably already uses it. However, you are mostly able to go for just about any grant. There's very few foundation grants that say no fiscally sponsored projects. Most of them do allow you to apply. And so really, as long as your fiscal sponsor is a strong and steady organization, the sky is going to be the limit to what you can apply for. And a lot of times, I know Amazon Smile is kind of weird because if you sign up, your fiscally sponsored project can't sign up either. But with grants, a lot of times if you contact them, like say your fiscal sponsor has applied, you can usually contact them and say, hey, I know it seems weird because we're submitting a second grant under the same paperwork. However, we're a fiscally sponsored project. For example, Ben & Jerry's, I seem to do that every year where we have to contact them for a fiscally sponsored project that has already submitted a grant. They let us submit 2 grants every year. So it's really awesome. So a lot of funders are really kind to fiscally sponsored projects. So really the sky is the limit there. How do we initiate partnerships? Are there any green flags or red flags to choosing partners? Should we have worked with them previously? I'm so sorry, my friend is blowing up my chat. I'm trying to get it away. Okay, so how do we initiate partnerships? Are there any red flags or green flags to choosing partners? Should we have worked with them previously? So there are some red flags and there are some green flags. So your main red flag, if you get a partner and they only want you to do stuff, it's like in a relationship. If only one person is putting in the work, it's not going to work out. So you want to be sure that it's very much a quid pro quo, scratch my back kind of situation where you offer them some help and they offer you help in return. If it's ever one way, definitely a red flag. We don't want that partnership at all. Green flags are people that are really, really easy to communicate with. You don't have to track down. You get emails and calls back pretty quickly from them, and they really genuinely seem like they want to really build your partnership so that you can help more people. It's those people that have that altruistic thoughts that really we want to partner with. We want to partner with people that are similar to ourselves in our passion for our mission. Those are all green flags. And you do not generally have to have worked with them previously. A lot of times you can just reach out and like cold contact somebody and say, hey, you do the same thing as me in my community. Would you like to go have some coffee and see how we can help each other? Really building relationships is at the core of what we do with nonprofits. I know it doesn't seem like that, but we're constantly building relationships with the people that we serve. Why shouldn't we build relationships with the people that are serving them? So building those relationships will really strengthen your organization. And even if they don't want to have a partnership on paper, just getting out there and being able to network with them is worth its weight in gold. Whew, taking a breath. I talk really, really fast. I apologize. I know it's a problem. So if anybody needs me to clarify anything, please just let me know. Do we have any more questions? I can just start spouting off random facts again. Oh, I've got another question. What's the downside to establishing a 501c3 as a new founder versus going under a fiscal sponsor? These questions are amazing. I love them. Okay, so you have a couple different, there's pros and cons, right? So with a new 501c3, of course, you get the freedom of having your own organization, being able to kind of do your own thing without somebody having to provide oversight to you. However, in the beginning, it is much harder to find grant funding, and you're very much either self-funded or you have to have that fundraising gene, right? You have to keep fundraising. With a fiscal sponsor, on the other hand, it's easier to get community buy-in because the fiscal sponsor is usually more well known than your organization in the community. Because they're more well known, it's easier to get grant funding, easier to find donors, and so that's where the catch-22 is. And for example, I'm starting a nonprofit. I am doing a fiscally sponsored project first because I want to be able to take a little bit of time to get that community buy-in and be able to have really immediate grant readiness so I can get a little bit of startup funding. So really there's no right answer. It just depends on what works best for you. Are there rules for how we use the grant funding? So absolutely. If we're talking generally, there's always rules for grant funding foundation or state and federal. State and federal grants are much more picky with their rules than foundation grants ever will be. A lot of times you have to just report back to your foundation how you spent the money, and it's usually that's about it. With state and federal funding, a lot of times you have to submit receipts. Sometimes you may apply to a grant that is reimbursement, where you have to prove that you spent the money first before they'll give the money back to you. And basically, they make you sign a lot of really scary disclosures at the end of a submission, and you can get in a lot of trouble if you don't spend the money appropriately. So it's really, really serious being able to, if you win grant funding, have a really robust financial tracking system in place so that you do not get in trouble. Because when I say get in trouble, I mean, you could go to jail if you don't spend the money appropriately. If you had one suggestion for a new nonprofit for grant funding, what would it be? I would suggest to take a breath and know that the funding will come. Because a lot of people get so stressed in the beginning of having a nonprofit organization. And I know when you have a nonprofit, there's like 80 places that you need to go at once, and it feels like you're drawn in 100 directions. But taking a breath, centering yourself, and deciding what your priorities are, and being able to, go through your grant readiness checklist. And I have a grant readiness checklist that I can send to Gigi to send out after this, if Gigi would be okay with that. And what you need to do is just take a breath, go through your grant readiness checklist, go through everything, one thing at a time, just like one step at a time. Make sure that you are really, really, really taking your time to structure your organization, get all your paperwork in place. And the whole time, I want you to be thinking about that evaluation process that we were talking about. You want to really be sure to be collecting your data and be able to tell other people what you're doing and how much of an impact you're having on the people that you serve. But really, I would just start with a grant readiness checklist and go from there. Yeah, I agree, Gigi. Let's post it in the Academy Startup Guide so everybody can read it. I recommend everybody go through this grant readiness checklist. Let me see. How much time do you need to write a federal grant? Ooh, that's a hard question, Gigi. I appreciate whoever posted that in the Facebook group. So generally the rule of thumb for a federal grant is around 100 hours. It is a lot of work. I think the last federal grant I worked on had like 50 pages or something rather, and then a bunch of attachments. It's a lot of work, and usually RFPs are, so that's the request for proposal I was talking about, are between 25 and sometimes even 100 pages long, with just different requests of things that they want to see and want you to talk about in the proposal that you write. And so you have to allocate a lot of time. Generally speaking, grant writers will full-time work for 4 to 6 weeks on a federal grant to make sure that it gets done on time and of quality. Will you please discuss how the grants and type of grants you mentioned can be used for salaries? So the nice thing with state and federal funding is that state and federal funding is a lot more lax on paying for salaries. And sometimes, and this goes back to that request for proposals that I was mentioning, I've mentioned a couple times so far. The request for proposals will let you know of any disallowed funds. And just generally speaking, salaries are rarely listed in those, but be sure to check in every federal grant you apply for. So salaries, because programs are ran by salaries and most federal grants are program grants, you can allocate everybody that is even so much as touching the program a little bit, you can allocate their salary to the funding you're applying for. For example, say you have a program manager for whatever program you're applying for. That person would spend 100% of their time on the project. So you could ask the government to cover 100% of their salary. And then say you have an executive director who spends maybe 25% of their time on the project. You can actually, I know it's not all of their salary, but you can actually ask the government for that 25% of their salary because they're spending 25% of their time on this project. That is what is really, really, really unique about the government, is that you can kind of sparse that out. And additionally, government grants also cover benefits. So say, you have your program manager who is working 100% of the time on the project. Well, you can ask the government to cover 100% of their benefits. So their like workers' comp, their, what other benefits are there? Their health insurance, their state required benefits, things like that you can ask the government for. So that was a great question. Thank you so much. So what focus areas tend to receive the most funding? Ooh, this is a hard question too. Y'all are amazing. So I don't know if anybody has ever heard of the Senate Appropriations Committee. And so this is a group of people in the Senate that decide where federal money goes to grants. And it changes every single year. So I did a couple of trainings earlier in the year about this, but we've actually, and of course, like I said, changes every year by multiple millions of dollars. So there's never any way to know what receives the most funding. The trend I can warn you about is that there's actually been a decline in funding for youth programs over the last few years out of the Senate Appropriations Committee. I know between 2021 and 2022, we lost maybe $5 million in youth victims of violence type grants. So it will change every single year. It's one of those things that is more complicated to track, but every year around November, you can actually start watching the Senate Appropriations Committee to see what they're talking about and get an idea of what may increase or reduce on funding. Karen, I do have a grant readiness checklist available to access. We are going to be uploading that in the Learning Academy under, I believe Gigi said, startup resources, so that everybody could access it. What is the average salary you should ask for the founder of a newly started nonprofit? So this is a harder question to answer, and the government actually has a form that you have to fill out for federal grants called disclosure related to employee compensation, ensuring that your executive director is paid fairly and not overpaid. Because a lot of people will say, my executive director makes $400,000 and then pocket the cash, right? And so what you look for at what you could ask for is you want to look at different websites that offer local salaries. So places like Indeed, Glassdoor, to see in your town and your local community what the average salary is for a nonprofit director. And oftentimes that's at least going to be $40,000. And I say $40,000 because I live in Ohio. Ohio is incredibly cheap. And that is actually, I think $45,000 is our average executive director salary. Now you go to California, I work with an organization out of Los Angeles. Their average salary for an executive director is $90,000 to $120,000. So it really will depend on your location. So do a lot of research and be sure you can back it up. Whatever you ask the government for, that disclosure can come back to bite you. So make sure that you have some research somewhere that says that that is an average salary. Do you recommend the Academy weekly workshops to prepare for federal grants and get an introduction to working with you? Absolutely. You get to see me once a week for an hour. And it is literally all about grant readiness. And I'm hoping that Gigi will let me do some more grant classes on federal grants because I really enjoy federal grants. And then that'll get more people involved with federal grants. Can an evaluation process include quotes from people who have benefited from our organization? So that is actually something that we would call either testimonials or surveys. And so, yes, absolutely. What we look for in that evaluation process is that it's not just one or two people, though, because we look at sample size, right? When we talk about data, the more people that you survey, the more accurate your data is. And so, yes, testimonials are amazing, but we want to make sure that we are collecting some sort of report from every single person, or at least trying to, from every single person who receives some sort of support from us, and then being able to say, 90% of the people who came to us, had positive reviews is an evaluation. Instead of just, one person says it, we want to be able to have, a percentage of the people that came to us say this about us. I know it's confusing. Outcomes are so confusing. And I talk to the poor people in the Learning Academy about them all the time. There is a really, really great book called Proposal Writing, and it's by Sage Books, and I'll find the link and drop it before we leave. But it literally has the easiest explanation for how to do outcomes and evaluation reports in it. And I have a PDF copy, and I'm wondering if we can link it in the Academy. I'll figure that out later. Let me see. So I'll drop that link in there, and that's a great place to look at evaluation reports. So what about mental health for kids funding? So there's actually a lot of mental health funding. Since the Biden administration has quote unquote taken a stand for mental health, there's been an increase in mental health funding from the CDC, from the National Office for Mental Health or something. There's so many acronyms. So there is a lot of mental health funding. And there is some mental health funding specifically for youth. And so this is where you would go to, and I've mentioned this before, this is where you would go to grants.gov, which is like the only grant search software for the federal government. And you'd be able to go in there and pick mental health, look specifically at mental health grants, and see what exactly you would qualify for. How much do you recommend we receive in funding prior to looking for federal funds? There's no real earmark for that. Generally speaking, if you are receiving grants of, $10,000, $20,000, you're probably able to start your grant readiness for state and federal grant process. Is there an ideal time frame for years in existence? Absolutely not. So with federal grants, as long as you are structured well, I mean, you could be brand new and they would still be able to consider you. It's all about the structuring, and a lot of times structuring comes with time. I haven't really been as successful with grant applications on the federal level with organizations less than 3 years old, just to give you a frame of reference there. What grants should we apply for first to later prepare us for federal funds? I would recommend anything at the government level. And government doesn't mean federal. So I would apply for city grants, county grants, even a couple of state grants. There's some smaller state grants. And those will kind of let you dip your toe into federal funding, so to say, because even though they're not federal grants, they still have a little bit of the same structure with a lot less of the risk. You know, you're not going to spend 100 hours to not get the funding because county and city grants will probably take you 4 or 5 hours. So those would probably be the easiest ease into it. So do churches get state and federal grants? If so, how do we apply? So unfortunately, most churches are exempt from this kind of funding. However, a lot of churches also have, aha, Gigi, you were thinking the same way that I was. So a lot of churches also have 501c3s attached. And so your church can, be the home for your 501c3. But if your 501c3 is technically separate on paper, then yeah, you can apply for federal funding. So thank you. We're on the same wavelength today, Gigi. Does anyone else have any questions? We have 9 minutes left in the hour that has been allocated. I would love to fill them all up. But I also don't like silence, so I'm gonna probably talk about some random federal facts. So there's a lot of really like minuscule things that you have to worry about with federal funding, and one of them is technical issues. And you wouldn't think the federal government would be renowned for technical issues, but it is. And so one of the bigger things that I can recommend to take away from today, beyond structuring and all the other important things, is to get your application in as early as possible. Let me just say, I seem to spend about 6 to 8 hours on the phone with the federal government every time I submit a federal grant, because the portal never works. And just plan for it every time so you don't miss out on that funding. It is horrible to spend all that time, all that effort on a federal grant to not be able to submit because of a technical issue. Could a church be considered as a fiscal sponsor? So for foundation grants, yes, absolutely. For federal grants, no, that's not going to work out, because the church still wouldn't be able to be the 501 receiving the funding. There's a lot of weird rules with churches getting federal funds, so you have to really be careful there. But if the church has, like Gigi said, like an outreach group attached, something else where they have a nonprofit attached to them, then yeah, that organization could be the fiscal sponsor. Church being a fiscal sponsor doesn't work out a ton. I've worked with organizations that have churches as fiscal sponsors. It is really complicated, and a lot of times funders who see a church, a synagogue attached to a grant application, you'll not have as much chance at getting the funding, because most foundations have requirements against what they call proselytizing. So providing religious services to people that are receiving nonprofit services. And so a lot of times the easiest thing to do, and I just had a phone call like this the other day. The easiest thing to do is have a nonprofit that offers all of the services, and then be able to offer your religious services to the people at the nonprofit with no requirement that they have to go to those services, because that's the biggest thing. We can't require people to go to services to receive services from a nonprofit. Let me see. Do they require you have an audit before applying? Federal grants don't. I mean, if you have one, you can apply it. You can add it to most of your applications, but a lot of times it's not required. Most of the times you're going to see a requirement for an audit for larger foundation grants, like $25,000, $50,000, $100,000. And I really, if you can get away without the audit, audits are important, but audits are really expensive. And I know not a lot of people in this room want their nonprofit to spend $3,000 a year on getting an audit, when, you know, your 990 form will probably suffice when you're starting out, because we're newer nonprofits. So I would really talk to your tax professional about your audit, talk to your finance person about your audit, but it's not required for federal grants. And I would wait until you at least have an income of $100,000 a year before you start spending money on an audit. Is storytelling important to the federal grant process? Of course. And so federal grant storytelling is way different than foundation grant storytelling. It's a lot drier. It's a lot more boring. I tell people, even though it's not fiction, foundation grants read a lot more like a fiction novel, where you're trying to elicit emotions from somebody. So it's still all facts, but you're trying to get a little bit of an emotional response from the founder or the funder. Whereas federal grants are very, this is a science textbook, this is a term paper. It's all very boring. There's a lot of citations. It's a different style of writing, but still storytelling nonetheless. Private family organization, what are your thoughts? So I'm hoping, Gigi, that you could you ask the person in the Facebook if they're talking about like a 509A nonprofit, like a private foundation under a 501. So private family organizations, there's a couple different ways that I can look at this. So sometimes that means, you know, your whole board is family members, which the IRS doesn't allow. 51% of your board has to be non-family members, and I recommend not having a single family member on your board. But that's just because of conflict of interest. As far as if they're talking about a private foundation, I would caution everybody who is not privately funded, so not funded by yourself, to not form as a private foundation, simply because there's barely any grant funding there. So there was, as of 2 years ago, there was a lot more grant funding out there for private foundations, but the last couple of years, I've noticed a really sharp decline in the amount of foundations that are allowing what we call 509A, which is a 501c3. It's just a subclassification, and there's not a ton of funding out there. So I would really caution people against that. Where to find startup grants for new nonprofits? That's a good question. So the best grant search software, and I get paid by none of them, just to put that out there. The best grant search software for newer nonprofits, simply because a lot of them require you to have a certain level of revenue before you apply to them, is Grant Gopher. And that's grantgopher.com. It's $9 a month, and it's got really beginner grants on it. And that's the link I just put in there. Can I clarify what I said about the churches can be a home for a nonprofit? Meaning providing an office space. So churches can, I'm so sorry, let me clarify this. Churches can be a fiscal sponsor as long as they're a nonprofit church. They cannot be a fiscal sponsor for a federal grant. So for foundation grants, yes. Federal grants, no. But I would recommend not having a church as your fiscal sponsor because of the fact that a majority of foundations do not fund religious-based organizations. And so even if your program is not, you know, religious-based, they'll still look at your fiscal sponsor and say, we can't fund because your oversight is provided by a religious organization. So I apologize for that. But churches can provide office space, they can fiscal sponsor, should not ever do any sort of federal anything for churches. So no like fiscal sponsorship or pastor funding for churches. But yes, for private foundations, I just do not recommend it. Awesome. So we are at 8:59. So this is really wrapping up the evening. So I want to, for everybody who is interested in talking more in depth about this, please, please, please feel free to send me a calendar request. If you have additional questions, I am in the Learning Academy. I am also in the Facebook group. My name is Nicole Farrell, and you can look me up in the Facebook group. Gigi can also send you my way. I will also type my super long email in here. Please put that you're coming from Nonprofit for Newbies in the subject line, so I know where you're coming from, because I get people talking to me from everywhere. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me there. Feel free to reach out to me in the Learning Academy. Feel free to reach out to Gigi. Anything, because I love writing people grants, and I love helping people help people. And so if you need help, feel free to reach out. But I hope everybody has a great night, and I will talk to you soon, I'm sure, because I'm going to talk to Gigi about hosting some more classes. Good night, everybody.